Hello and welcome to the new season of the Drawn and Redrawn, the Making of India's Internal Boundaries podcast. This is a part of a larger India State Stories project that explores the evolution of India's political and administrative boundaries. This project is an undertaking by the Centre for Legislative Education and Research at Flame University in Pune. In this new season, we embark on a journey through the fascinating histories and narratives of each Indian state and union territories, exploring the pivotal events, influential personalities, and societal transformations that have shaped the subcontinent. In this sixth episode, we learn the history behind how the state of Chhattisgarh was created. This episode is based on a corresponding article written by our team at India State Stories. These articles have been converted to audio conversations with the help of Google's Notebook LM. You can find the relevant article link in the show notes. Now, let's dive into the conversation.
Today we're looking at a state that it creates a bit of a paradox on the map. If you look at India, Chhattisgarh sits right there in the center. It's this distinct sort of seahorse shape carved out of Madhya Pradesh. Now, that happened in 2000. It looks very modern, just an administrative decision.
Right, a line drawn at the turn of the millennium.
Exactly. But when you actually get into the sources, you realize this is not a new idea at all. This is a story that's, arguably thousands of years old.
It absolutely is. And honestly, if you only look at that map change in 2000, you're just seeing the result, not the struggle. We need to reframe this.
Okay.
This isn't just about a state being formed. It's about a specific region and the people in it, fighting to hold on to an identity against outsiders for, centuries, whether those outsiders were empires, British colonizers, or eventually politicians in Bhopal.
So let's start there with that geography. And the sources mention these names, Dakshin Kosala and Dandakaranya. Now, I've heard Dandakaranya in the Ramayana, right? It's this dense, impenetrable forest where Rama goes into exile. Is that the same place?
It's the exact same region. And that connection to the Ramayana, it just gives you a sense of how deep these cultural roots go.
Mm-hmm.
So Dakshin Kosala was the ancient political name, but Dandakaranya, that describes the ecology.
The forest itself.
The forest itself. It translates to something like the forest of punishment. Historically, you had rulers like the Chidis, the Chalukyas, and then Mughal suzerainty. But here's the key thing. Unlike the northern plains where empires would just wipe out local cultures, the geography of Chhattisgarh, those thick, difficult forests, it acted as a shield.
So the forest literally protected the tribal identity, a natural barrier.
Exactly. It allowed the tribal population to maintain a completely distinct cultural footprint. Regardless of who was technically the emperor. The map might have said Mughal Empire, but on the ground, life was still very local, very tribal, and very autonomous.
But that shield, that protection, eventually becomes the problem. Because when the British arrive, they don't look at a forest and see a cultural shield or a mythological setting. They see something very different.
They see a balance sheet. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. This is where we get the idea of the colonial gaze. When the British took control, they look at the region through this strictly utilitarian lens. For the local communities, the Gonds, the Maria, the forest was everything. It was their habitat, a fluid resource for hunting, gathering.
Their supermarket, their temple, their home.
All of it. And to the British,
it's timber.
It's a timber factory waiting to be harvested. They wanted sal trees for railway sleepers, teak for ships. So they start bringing in these laws that just criminalize the local way of life. They ban shifting cultivation because, you can't tax people who keep moving. They restricted access to the forest. It wasn't just oppression in a vague sense. It was a systematic dismantling of their entire economic life.
They basically turned them from owners into trespassers.
Trespassers in their own backyard. You hit the nail on the head.
Which, of course, leads to pushback. I was reading about this Gondwana movement in the sources, and this surprised me. I didn't realize the demand for a separate state went back that far. They actually wanted a state called Gondwana.
They did.
Yeah.
And it came from the Bastar region, the Deep South, which is heavily tribal. They wanted autonomy to protect their customs from that British legal machinery we just talked about. But, and this is so crucial for understanding why it took another century for Chhattisgarh to exist, the movement failed. It failed because of a specific internal fault line.
What was that? Was it just a lack of power against the British?
It was geography and culture.
Mm-hmm.
You had the tribal heartland in the hills wanting Gondwana, but then you have the central plains around Raipur. That area is, the rice bowl of central India.
Right.
It's agricultural, it's settled, and it's dominated by caste Hindus, by farmers The Gondwana movement just could not bridge that gap between the forest dwellers in the hills and the rice farmers in the plains.
So the rice growers didn't see their fight as the same fight.
Not at all. And without that coalition, the British could just ignore them. It shows you that early on, there wasn't one unified Chhattisgarh identity. There were just different groups reacting to the British in very different ways.
And that distinction, that hills versus plains thing, seems to be a recurring theme. So let's fast forward a bit to the independence movement. Gandhi shows up in 1920. Now, Gandhi goes everywhere, but the sources seem to suggest his visit here did something very specific for the structure of the resistance.
It really did. So Gandhi came for the Khilafat and non-cooperation movements, but the unintended side effect was organizational. His visit basically lit a fire under the local leaders, who then formed the Raipur District Congress Committee in 1924.
Why does one district committee matter so much in the grand scheme of things?
Because for the very first time, the demand for a separate identity wasn't just a tribal revolt in the forest, it was written down in a formal resolution. By a recognized political body, they explicitly asked for a separate province.
So it moved the argument from the battlefield to the negotiating table.
It legitimized it, yes.
Yeah.
In the eyes of the modern political class, it was now a real formal demand.
Okay, so let's jump to 1947. The British are leaving, the map of India is being drawn, and there's this incredible what-if moment in the notes called the Eastern States Union. This sounds like, I don't know, a massive missed opportunity or just a chaotic moment.
It is a huge what-if. In August 1947, right as independence is happening, the rulers of the Eastern States Agency, these are all the princely states in the region, they try to form this massive autonomous bloc. The Eastern States Union.
Like a third power.
Essentially, not quite India, not quite Pakistan, but a federation of princes.
So why aren't we looking at a map with the Eastern States Union on it today? It sounds like they had the resources.
Two big reasons. First, the new Indian State Ministry, led by Sardar Patel, was having absolutely none of it. They saw it as balkanization, a threat to the nation. But secondly, and I think this is more interesting, it imploded from within.
How so?
Major states like Moyarbonj and, crucially, Bastar refused to join.
Why would Bastar refuse? Wouldn't a union have given them more power than being swallowed by India?
Well, Bastar was skeptical. They feared losing their own specific autonomy to this larger collective of princes. It's the classic problem, small states fearing the big brothers in the room. They worried their tribal identity would be drowned out. So the whole thing collapsed.
And the result?
The result is the region gets merged into the central provinces in Berar, which, down the line, becomes the giant state of Madhya Pradesh.
And that merger is what sets the stage for the next 50 years of conflict, because now Chhattisgarh is just the eastern wing of a massive state being ruled from Bhopal. And this is where we get to the core argument, the drain of wealth.
Right. This is the intellectual engine of the whole statehood movement.
Ah.
In 1956, a leader named Kubchan Bagal forms the Chhattisgarh Braj Hussain. And he starts looking at the numbers, and he realizes something pretty shocking about where the money is going.
It sounds a lot like the argument Indian nationalists made against the British. You take our raw materials, you make money, and we stay poor.
It is the exact same logic, just applied internally within India. Bagal pointed out that Chhattisgarh was generating all this surplus, the coal, the iron ore, the electricity, the rice. But that revenue was being siphoned off, drained, to develop the western parts of Madhya Pradesh, places like Indore and Gwalior.
So they were the engine room, but the passengers in first class were all sitting in Bhopal and Indore.
That is a perfect analogy, and Bagal made sure everyone knew it. But here's the thing. Economic arguments, they usually only appeal to the elites, right? The educated class. To make this a mass movement, you needed someone to translate that into dignity.
And that's where Shankar Guha Niyogi comes in. Niyogi seems like a very different kind of figure from Bagal. Bagal was the politician. Niyogi was what? A revolutionary. The sources paint him as a very intense figure.
You could call him a trade unionist, but he was so much more than that. He founded the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, the CMM, and he organized the mine workers, the farmers, but he did something brilliant. He connected labor rights directly with regional identity.
How did he do that? He told the workers, look, you are poor not just because you are workers, but because you are Chhattisgarhi workers whose land is being exploited by outsiders.
So he linked the who we are with the how we're being treated.
Precisely. And he brought in the ecological angle. He fought against the destruction of local forests for, say, industrial monocultures like pine trees, which the industry loved but the locals couldn't use. He just broadened the tent. Suddenly, statehood wasn't just for politicians wanting a seat. It was for the miner, the farmer, the tribal, the environmentalist.
He really combined the red flag of labor
Mm-hmm.
with the green flag of the forest.
And that combination is what finally created a unified Chhattisgarhi identity. It bridged that gap between the rice farmers and the hill tribes that had doomed the movement way back in the British era.
So by the 70s and 80s, the pressure is really building. The drain of wealth theory is out there. The social movement is active. And you start seeing mainstream politicians realizing, uh-oh, we have a problem. They just couldn't ignore it anymore. You had leaders like Purushottam Kaushik running on explicitly pro-statehood platforms. Then you have Arjun Singh, the Congress Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh. Now, imagine his position. He's the CM of the whole state, but he has to admit that one part of his state is being neglected. So in the 80s, he sets up the Chhattisgarh Vikas Pratikaran, a dedicated development authority.
That feels like a bit of a Band-Aid, like, here's a special committee, please stop asking for your own state.
It was a concession, for sure, but it was also a validation. It was the state itself admitting, yes, you are different, and yes, you have special needs. Plus, you had demographic shifts. More and more OBCs and tribal leaders were getting into the legislative assembly. The political gravity was just shifting.
Which brings us to the 1990s. And honestly, reading the timeline here, it feels like a race. Suddenly, the Congress and the BJP, who agree on almost nothing, are both promising statehood.
It became a political necessity. It's as simple as that. By the 90s, the electoral math was just undeniable. You could not form a stable government in Madhya Pradesh without winning a chunk of seats in the Chhattisgarh region. Both parties knew it.
It's almost comical. In 1993, they both put it in their manifestos. In 94, the Congress Chief Minister, Digvijay Singh, passes a unanimous resolution for statehood. Then in 98, Atal Bihari Vajpayee from the BJP promises it at a rally. It's like they were tripping over each other to be seen as the savior of the region.
It was political opportunism, of course it was.
Yeah.
But it also shows you that the movement had won the argument. The drain of wealth narrative was so powerful that no national party could afford to ignore it. If you wanted votes in that massive block of central India, you had to promise separation.
And so the finish line comes into view. On November 1st, 2000, the map finally changes. The Madhya Pradesh Reorganization Act comes into effect.
And you have to notice the unique setup at birth.
Yeah.
You had the BJP in power at the center
Yeah.
in Delhi, so they're the ones who passed the law. But the Congress had the majority of MLAs in the region from the last election. So you get this new state where the Congress, led by Ajit Jogi, forms the first government.
So the BJP delivers the state.
It hands the keys to the Congress. A
Yeah.
very complicated delivery, yes.
Yes. So the state is born with 16 districts, but today, looking at the notes, there are 33. That's more than double.
Yeah.
Is that just bureaucracy expanding for its own sake, or is there a strategy there?
Oh, there's a very specific strategy. It's an attempt to solve that hills versus plains divide we talked about. Remember, this is a huge, difficult terrain. By breaking it down into 33 smaller districts, the government is trying to bring administration closer to those remote tribal areas.
Right.
It's hard to govern a forest from a city 300 kilometers away. Smaller districts mean the district collector is physically closer to the people.
And speaking of those people, let's look at the demographics. The sources say over 30% of the population is tribal. 42 different tribes. We're talking about the Gonds, the Baiga, the Pardi.
And it's not just a statistic. These communities have such distinct relationships with the land. For example, the Baiga tribe. They're one of
Yeah.
the PDTGs.
Sorry, let's pause on that acronym. PVTG. What does that actually mean?
It stands for particularly vulnerable tribal groups. In simple terms, these are communities that have historically remained, say, pre-agricultural or use very basic technology. They don't plow land. They might still rely heavily on hunting and gathering.
Okay.
And because they don't have farms, in the way we think of them, standard land laws often make them invisible. They're the most at risk of losing their entire livelihood when a mine opens up or a dam gets built.
So how does the new state handle that? Because the whole point of separation, the whole drain of wealth argument, was to stop that kind of exploitation.
And that is the central tension of modern Chhattisgarh. The state has been pretty aggressive in implementing the Forest Rights Act. They're trying to recognize what are called habitat rights.
How is that different from just giving someone a land deed?
A land deed says, this square of soil is yours. Habitat rights say, this entire forest ecosystem, where you gather your herbs, where you worship, where you fish, this whole area belongs to the community.
Wow.
It's an attempt to legally recognize that the forest isn't just timber, it's a home. It's an attempt to recognize the collective ownership that existed before the British even showed up.
So it's trying to reverse that colonial gaze we started the whole deep dive with.
On paper, yes. It's an attempt to use modern laws to protect very ancient customs.
But the resources are still there. The coal is still in the ground. The iron ore hasn't moved.
And the demand for them is higher than ever. India needs energy, and Chhattisgarh is sitting on top of the coal. This is the complexity the state lives with every single day. It was formed to stop the drain of wealth, to keep the money local. But to generate that money, you still have to dig, you still have to mine. And often, the mining happens exactly where the PVTGs live.
So the question isn't whether to extract, but who benefits from it.
That's it. Is the wealth actually staying in the region and helping these communities? Or is it just creating a new class of inequality within the state itself?
It's a fascinating arc. We go from ancient forests acting as a shield to the British stripping away rights to this political realization that we are rich yet we are poor, and finally to a state that has to manage that very wealth.
It really highlights that a border isn't just a line on a map. It's a container for all of these aspirations. So Chhattisgarh wasn't just carved out by some bureaucrat. It willed itself into existence through decades of persistence.
And as we wrap up, it seems like the experiment is very much still live. This isn't a history lesson that ended neatly in 2000.
No, not at all. And I think the listeners should consider this one question as they look at the map of Chhattisgarh today.
What's that?
Well, consider this. The demand for the state was born out of a fight against the drain of wealth, this idea that outsiders were looting the resources. Now, 20-plus years later, Chhattisgarh controls its own boundaries, its own 33 districts. But has the state actually solved the paradox? Is it possible to be a mining powerhouse and a protector of tribal habitat rights at the same time?
Or has the drain just changed hands from Bhopal to Raipur?
That is the big question.
The difference between possessing the resources and protecting the people who live on top of them.
That is the story to watch.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this. It's amazing how much history is packed into that one central block of India.
My pleasure.
And thank you to everyone listening. You can find the maps we discussed and the full article in the show notes. We'll see you in the next deep dive.